Hey, it's Jordan. I'm here with Matt Taibbi. He is a journalist with Rolling Stone. And if you need any substantive books this post-holiday season, author of I Can't Breathe, which I finally finished. Amazing on Eric Garner and honestly the wider criminal injustice system, if you ask me. And I also read Insane Clown Presidency, which was in all these pontificated books about what created Trump. I think this was one of the better ones and entertaining. So I wanted to talk to you for multiple reasons. Uh, there is zero, really zero talk about this on cable news. I don't really see that much in print. So Goldman Sachs,
Yeah.
which played a large role in the global financial crash, um, they got off with a slap on the wrist. They are now being criminally prosecuted by the Malaysian government. Most people
Investigated. Yeah.
investigated, excuse me,
Mhm.
um, for this really convoluted, hard to explain um, 1MDB scandal, which Goldman Sachs essentially sold bonds for the Malaysian government and took insane fees. I'm going to stop trying to explain it. Can you explain? Because you've wrote, and I've heard from a lot of experts that this is the most serious trouble they've been in,
Yeah.
maybe ever.
Yeah. I think it's as, Goldman was in serious trouble in September of 2008. The company probably would have gone under a couple of times, like without the AIG bailout. There was a moment when they applied for a late night bank holding company charter in late September of 2008, which allowed them to borrow from the Fed the next morning. If they didn't get that, they were probably in trouble. Since then, this is the most serious thing to hit the bank. And it's the problem with this scandal is it's a little bit tough to explain to American audiences because it takes place far away, and B, because it's about a kind of theft that has never really been done before. So the explanation, the easiest way to explain it is this: dictators have always stolen stuff. All right. So if you're Mobutu Sese Seko or Marcos or Suharto, what do? Your company produces rubber or diamonds or coal or whatever it is. There's usually a state fund or a state enterprise that sells that stuff, and then the dictator rigs the numbers and then diverts most of the proceeds to himself, to a Swiss bank account. What happened in Malaysia was a twist on that. They didn't even bother getting a product. What they did is they created a sovereign wealth fund called 1MDB, and they went around to investors all over the world and they said, we want to build stuff in Malaysia. We want to build buildings, agricultural projects, infrastructure. So we need to raise money for these projects, and then we have this great investment bank which is going to handle the bonds. So you give to us, and you'll get returns on it very quickly. So they raised like $6.5 billion, but they never did any of the actual work. The money just went off to basically a series of dummy accounts close to the prime minister Najib Razak and a couple of insiders, and like $6.5 billion disappeared. Goldman made roughly $600 million on this deal, and all they really needed was a corrupt dictator and a couple of Goldman bankers. So
And,
it's a scam of the century.
and like to really put it so people could see it, like part of the proceeds that was supposed to go to like building buildings and agricultural went to casinos, actually funding, ironically, the Wolf of Wall Street with
Yeah.
Leonardo DiCaprio. Really extravagant artwork. I mean, it basically went to like toys for the dictator. And Goldman, essentially, they came in 2012. They were, the liaison to some of the bonds. But is it true that Goldman kind of fudged what what the money was going towards? Because of course Goldman says they were lied to by the Malaysian government, but what
And
was
by their own
Goldman?
bankers. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
what was Goldman's part in this?
So, okay, first of all, this deal could never have worked without a bank like Goldman, because the money is coming from big institutional investors like other sovereign wealth funds. like the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. So you have like the Saudis or the Emiratis, and they're giving hundreds of millions of dollars into this fund. And they're not going to do that for just some guy who shows up on their door. Without a reputable Western bank issuing the bonds, they're not going to do it. So Goldman had two bankers in Kuala Lumpur, one named Roger Ng and another named Tim Leisner, who was a German-born guy. And they put together all these deals. And essentially what they did is they went around the world, and in some cases there were bribes paid to the buyers. So it's hard to explain. Basically, they would go to another big state-controlled pile of money. There'd be some functionary in charge of guarding that cash. They would give that person a big chunk of money, and then that person would spend some other government's money to go into this fund. But you're absolutely right. Like, one of the people who was involved in this was a guy named Joe Low, who was like a liaison to the Malaysian prime minister. And he ended up taking a lion's share of this money. And you ever seen the movie Brewster's Millions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was like that. Like, they had so much money they couldn't spend it fast enough. And this guy was going around the world. He was throwing parties like that cost $500,000 at a time. He was hiring Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre to play his parties for him. Alicia Keys. He was buying Van Goghs and Monets, and he was doing it as fast as he could, and they still couldn't burn through the cash fast enough. And that's how they caught him, essentially.
And I mean, to basically boil it down for the audience, why this affects America, not directly, but essentially, you've written so much and so well about the criminal justice system. Goldman Sachs, if anyone not that hasn't bought off the government, like if a regular Joe Schmo banker did this, wouldn't there be criminal liability as opposed to paying, settlements, which it seems to most Americans, the banks, they're just kind of putting this into their balance sheet, like as an expense, the expected fines they're going to pay.
Right.
So from 2008, as far as I know, there were no serious bankers put in jail. And now you have this, which is essentially, I don't know if it's a Ponzi scheme or what have you, but Goldman is essentially
it's like helping. A Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. So, okay, now there's an investigation. I think Malaysia is talking about like 7.5 billion in fines. But what is the American citizen to think? Because as far as I can see, bankers, I mean, it's now normalized that, all right, they don't have to worry about actual criminal time for these kinds of things.
Right. Yeah. The expectation is the government's going to come up with a number for Goldman to pay. And the way this usually works is a bunch of people get together in a room and they decide how much the bank can pay without it impacting their bottom line too much. Probably we're going to end up in the neighborhood of somewhere between $3 to $5 billion, I think, is going to be the penalty, which is a massive penalty. I mean, you think about Deepwater Horizon, it's like, it's that level of a problem. But Goldman will probably sneak through. Now, there are two bankers that were based in Malaysia have already been criminally charged. One has already pleaded guilty, which is already a little unusual. But the question is, does it go higher? And there's some evidence that that the figures in this scheme met with some of the senior executives at Goldman Sachs. So there is a possibility that there could be something, but you're very right. Most likely that nothing will happen, and somebody who steals $6 or $7 billion is not going to go to jail. Well, who is in jail, right? People who steal dime bags and that sort of thing.
And Lloyd Blankfein, he was I think the CEO of Goldman Sachs or president.
CEO.
Yeah, mm-hmm. He retired conveniently around the same time this happened. So there's I don't know if if it's been proven yet, but there's reports that he met with Malaysian officials directly about this. Obviously, if a head of a bank was held liable and possibly had criminal consequences, that might deter other banks from doing this. Where does Blankfein come into this?
So what Goldman told me is that they've looked back in the past and they've found three instances where Blankfein might have met with Joe Lowe, the guy who was doing that Brewster's Millions spending spree. And of those three instances, they can only say for sure that Lowe was at one of them. There's been some reports that was a face-to-face meeting, and the news of that, which leaked out in November, was what caused Goldman's share price to start going in the toilet. It was in the mid 200s range. It was 230, 240, something like that. It's now down in the $160 range. The company's lost about 30 to 35% of its value in the last year, with most of that coming in the last 3 months, almost entirely because of that news. Because the expectation was, oh yeah, they'll just write a check and this will go away. But this speaks to the possibility, at least, that something else could happen.
And moving from one treacherous bank to another, Wells Fargo, they basically created fake accounts,
Right.
millions of fake accounts, and now it's not a small amount, but I guess to them, is it really a lot? Facing $575 million in settlements to all 50 states, including DC. Wells Fargo, I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start because there's been so many headlines with Wells Fargo over the last couple of years. But they opened 3.5 million fake bank and credit card accounts without customer knowledge. They've already been fined $1 billion from 2 federal regulators. Is Wells Fargo going to face? I mean, I'm asking you knowing the answer, but what am I missing with what happened with Wells Fargo, and are they facing any criminal liability?
I think Wells Fargo is more of a pure depository bank than Goldman is. Their trouble is probably less serious than Goldman's is, because Goldman is facing a couple of different problems at once. Number one, it's facing this scandal is being investigated in 10 different countries. There's all kinds of people out with their hand out to try to get the money back. There's 2 class action suits. There's the possibility of penalties in Malaysia, Singapore, the United States, all over the world. It's going to be an enormous amount of money. Wells is the phony accounts thing. It's basically just a run-of-the-mill scandal that these banks get into all the time. And $500 million isn't so much to these people for a fine. The company has had a lot of trouble, though. I mean, they reputationally, they went through, I think for customers that this is a serious trust issue for them. You go in, you give somebody your personal information, you don't know what they're doing with it. They also got caught. They were the first bank that got caught overtly targeting minorities in their subprime mortgage scam. They had emails back and forth in the Maryland office talking about selling loans to mud people and creating ghetto loans, and they had to pay a big fine for that. So that bank has taken a big hit too. But I think Goldman right now, between the shareholder run on the stock and all the various investigations, it's in a much more serious place.
And let me ask you, broadening it out to American politics. So for the first time since 2008, Wall Street donated more to the Democratic Party during the midterms than to the Republican Party. As of October 17th, so like a month before the midterms, they donated $85 million to Democrats. So we know Wall Street usually hedges its bets. I mean, Wall Street was donating to Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. They usually donate, I wouldn't say equally, but they always sprinkle both parties, usually more the Republican Party. Now
it's pretty close, but it's usually more to the Republicans. Yeah.
Right. So what do you see as the reason for this uptick? Obviously, it was expected the Democrats were going to retake the House, because I'm hearing the message. We all hear the message from Democrats. Trump's the Antichrist. America will be just dandy once we get rid of Trump and the tax scam and all these things. But I haven't seen, other than rhetorical change, I haven't seen much policy change from the Democratic Party when it comes to Wall Street, regulations, or any substantive. I mean, I was just researching. Wall Street, Goldman Sachs has gotten $800 million in state and federal subsidies since 2000. I mean, it's Amazing.
800 billion?
800 million.
800 million. Oh,
800
yeah.
million.
It's probably more than that, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's
I
what
mean, they got 13 billion just in the AIG bailout, if you count that.
I'm
So,
yeah, no, this is a different category. I'm
oh, I see.
talking from Good Jobs First has them at 800 million in state and federal grants,
Mm,
and in the bailout, they have them at almost a billion. Yeah.
yeah.
So, um, what do you think as far as Wall Street looking ahead to 2020? Seems like they're cozying up to Democrats quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I think they will, and I think that's one of the reasons why you're going to see an incredibly aggressive effort to try to get candidates like Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders kind of out of the picture, because that's the only thing that could queer that financial advantage for the Democrats. On Wall Street, there's a long tradition of people who are you would characterize as maybe socially liberal, but they're very sort of fiscally laissez-faire. They like the Democratic Party, the sort of Bob Rubin category of Democrat. Rubin was the head of Goldman. He was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, and there's a whole sort of long list of people who are of his ilk. And they clearly see Trump as a destabilizing force. They see him as a nationalist who imperils a lot of the progress they've made towards a sort of global banking system. Gary Cohn, for instance, was very anti-Brexit, but Trump invited him into the White House anyway. Gary Cohn was the sort of co-head of Goldman at the time.
Gary Cohn, who stole the trade deal off his desk. Gary Cohn.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think the Democrats are certainly going to have a huge financial advantage from most industries, depending on who the candidate is. I mean, if it's turns out to be Bernie or Sherrod Brown, who's pushed the too big to fail bill, or Liz Warren, I think that might change the equation a little bit. But
And do you think Wall Street, if you look at, I mean, I don't know what you think. I think Beto O'Rourke, I don't know if he's going to be a factor, in 6 months. I know he's the hot thing now, but you look at Beto O'Rourke, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joe Biden, obviously, a lot of rhetoric now. We're not taking they're Johnny come lately progressives. We're not taking corporate PAC money, even though we're still taking a lot of executive money. Do you think Wall Street kind of factors it in like, all right, well, we know if they're elected, they'll do the right thing. It's just to get elected.
Yeah. I think that's a big issue in the Democratic Party right now. I mean, obviously there's a huge schism in the land of people who would classify themselves as Democrats, and the root of that controversy is really about fundraising, because the kind of Sanders wing of the party, if you even want to call it, because of course he's not really a Democrat until he runs, but their idea is you can't be subsidized by the pharmaceutical industry, the financial services industry, the insurance industry, and then do populist legislation and protect people. So they're increasingly pushing candidates to take those pledges that you talked about, to not take CAP money or PSE money, excuse me. And I think, industry is very concerned about that. There are already rumblings that, this is a thing that's going to be an incredibly divisive issue in the party going forward. And I think you've seen that already with this little flare up over the Beto Bernie thing, which was really such a tempest in the teapot, but it was turned into such a huge deal because it hit right on that nerve about what this whole debate is about. I don't know what you think, but that's what it seemed to me.
Well, I'd like to ask you, because you've done some serious journalism, and God bless David Sirota, but I've never seen more reverse psychology in my life. I mean, the guy, that story, it was great, was the equivalent of C-SPAN. I mean, it was just literally a regurgitation of his record. And I mean, you have the Neera Tanden crowd, and even politicians making it seem like these are attacks. And you saw this from Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders, I mean, he barely laid a glove on her, and it was like, you're personally attacking me by pointing out my record. Um,
Right.
I, I think we're going to see more of this because they don't want to talk about the record or the donation. So there's kind of this deflection onto the Bernie Bros and attacks, and they're poisoning the well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think they're very troubling. I mean, I was with David just before he did that tweet. We were up in Vermont and for the Sanders gathering thing, and the people who think this is some kind of like Vermont-led conspiracy to hit Beto O'Rourke. Like, I didn't hear Beto O'Rourke's name once the whole time we were in Vermont. David, if you know him, gets pretty intense about subjects when he's covering a thing. He's been into oil and gas for the last 3 months. He did a 30,000 word feature. I mean, a 10,000 word feature, excuse me, on at the end of October, and he's very interested in this whole issue of industry financing local candidates, right, and doing that to amend, on the state or state house level. So he was just sort of flipping through Open Secrets, which is the tool that everybody uses to look at industry support, and he tweets out a link to the Open Secrets top contributors page, and that turned into this mother of all kerfuffles, attacks on Democrats. Like, if that's what they're going to call an attack, I mean, this is going to turn into the ugliest campaign season in history, because things are going to get way worse than that. And the idea that we can't even examine the record of a candidate. I don't have any feelings about Beto O'Rourke one way or the other, but I'd like to know what he voted for, and where the money's coming from. And I don't understand this idea that we shouldn't even talk about that. I think it's crazy.
Yeah, I was a little jealous, to tell you the truth, because I wrote a piece before the Senate election between he and Cruz. I said, if I was in Texas, of course I'd vote for Beto, but I mean, I found he was doing fundraisers with mega fossil fuel lobbyists right before the campaign. So anyway, I want to ask you. Obviously, the news is Elizabeth Warren is the first out of the gate. This was expected. I thought her video was fairly well. I have some gripes with her as far as being a little missing in action on some progressive fights. Economically, she obviously scares the living daylight out of Wall Street and that kind. But a lot of Bernie supporters, progressives, didn't like that she didn't endorse him, didn't like that she wasn't really outspoken against the Standing Rock movement at No Dapple. She's also voted for a lot of this wild military spending. What do you see as far as, I'm not asking you to procrastinate who's going to be the nominee, but what is the effect of her running? Because my only fear is she could splinter votes away from Bernie. I don't know if she has a realistic chance of being the nominee, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was a little surprised that there was this outpouring of negative press against Warren in I would say late November, early December, which is, having covered, this is going to be my fifth presidential campaign that I'm covering. Usually when you see that, it's an indication that the party is trying to send a message to a candidate, like, we don't want you to run, right? Like, if you run, we're going to keep calling up reporters and telling them all this negative stuff about you and how your campaign is doomed. So it's meant to be kind of a shot across the bow. And I didn't understand that, because from my point of view, the party should want Warren in the race for exactly the reason you cited. She's one of the few people who has a chance of splintering the Sanders vote if Sanders runs. But she's going to run. As a candidate, I've seen her. I hate to make like a traditional campaign reporter observation about her, but she doesn't enjoy the process of campaigning in the way that people who traditionally win these things do. The people who do well on the campaign trail, which is a real grind, physically and emotionally, they just love sort of glad-handing people and talking and holding forth. Bernie has more of a rabbinical thing going. He likes to teach, right? But Bill Clinton used to like to kind of hold like sermon sit-ins, right? Um, Warren is really reserved, even in the Senate. If you watch her from the Senate gallery, which I have from time to time, she doesn't schmooze with the other senators very much. But the one thing that she does have, which is really interesting, is she knows how Wall Street works. She's probably the first candidate who's ever run for president who could tell you, for instance, what derivatives clearing is and how it works. She's the first true financial literate, maybe except for Mitt Romney, who's run for office. And that will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how aggressively she starts talking about some of these issues, because she was very aggressive against people like Jamie Dimon during the London Whale episode, and she knows what the problems are. It's just a question of whether she's going to voice all of those things.
Right. And I want to ask you, because obviously you've written about criminal justice, economic oppression against black and brown people. Hillary Clinton got 5% less compared to Obama, African American turnout. Same numbers for Latino. I don't know if it was more she didn't inspire or what happened. Obviously, that is the fastest growing demographic, and I try not to get in fights with more Hillary Hillbots, but sometimes I do. To me, Bernie Sanders, he's made inroads with non-white voters, according to the polls. I don't know if he did the best job of explaining why his policies would disproportionately lift black and brown people. What are your thoughts? Because you hear from Trump, oh, we have the lowest unemployment among black people in American history. I mean, I cover Flint, Detroit, a lot of inner cities. That doesn't pop out to you that things are booming for minorities. What do
Right.
you think as far as the minority vote, and more importantly, this smokescreen that Trump is sending out?
Well, I mean, I'll agree with you and be critical of Bernie a little bit. I think he missed a lot of opportunities in 2016 to elucidate why the things that he was talking about would have resonated more with minority voters. I think there was a moment when Hillary said that thing about ending too big to fail won't end racism or whatever it was. And I think Bernie could have countered with a very coherent sort of exploration about what the subprime mortgage crisis really was, because it really at its core was a rehash of just ancient race crimes, the 40 acres and a mule, the contract mortgage, things that black and brown voters have been familiar with over the years. It was exactly the same scam. It was white people from the city going into poor, lower middle class minority neighborhoods, offering them basically too good to be true mortgages, getting their names on a dotted line, and then charging them injurious penalties. And he could have explained that. He could have explained that, look, the things that I'm trying to talk about, I'm trying to end institutional racism by going after these issues. And I don't think he articulated it as well as he could have. But we'll see. I mean, it's hard to say. I don't like to talk about sort of like the black vote. I think that's what it's a campaign cliche that always ends up kind of being misused. But there's no doubt that it's going to be a huge issue in this campaign. There's going to be a lot of sort of overt talk about race in a way that we haven't seen on the campaign trail probably ever, maybe since the 60s. It's just in the age of Trump, it's become such a central focus of everybody. So we'll see. We'll see how everybody shapes up on that.
I want to ask you, sometimes Trump by accident kind of appears like he's going to do the right thing. I was cautiously optimistic when he spoke about withdrawing troops from Syria. Then you had half of the troops from Afghanistan. Now we're pausing, as Lindsey Graham says, who I'm deathly afraid might be the next defense secretary.
Right.
Okay, we're pausing now on withdrawing troops from Syria and now Afghanistan. Well, he never actually said that. If there's anything that I think special interests are more worried about or equally worried about as to a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren presidency, the war industry is good for most special interests. What are your thoughts on Trump's rhetoric? Do you actually think there's going to be any follow through? I don't think it's a major issue among his base, but it seems that whatever his motive is, he does want to start winding down troops. I just don't actually see the execution there.
So when I was following Trump around the last election, one of the things I noticed early was that he started experimenting a little bit on the stump with talking about sort of more isolationist themes. He would criticize NATO here and there. He would start saying things like, we're spending all this money. We build a school over there. They blow up the school. We can't even build a school in Brooklyn. And I think what he noticed was the crowd was responding positively to that rhetoric. And Trump does have an ear for that kind of thing. When he starts to feel crowds moving in one direction, almost like a comedian, he will gravitate in that direction. And he does have inklings in that direction. I think he does think that on some level that there's a tremendous waste there with our military policy. He is not enthusiastic about NATO in general, our military commitments abroad. The problem is he's also very susceptible to criticism that he's weak. All right. So when people tell him that he needs to bomb somebody or else he's going to be weak, then he turns around and changes his mind 2 minutes later. And that's why he hasn't been consistent on this issue. But clearly what I saw on the campaign trail was that the instant he started talking about NATO in the way that he did, which was such an anathema, it's a total taboo in campaign politics. Nobody's ever really, no prominent candidate has ever really questioned that the structure of our interventionist policy abroad. That's when you started seeing such an avalanche of negative press toward him, and I think that's it's still a major point of contention. Like, that's the one thing they hate about him the most, even though to me that's the area where we should be encouraging that instinct with him, because I don't want him anywhere near a war or press. I don't want him carrying the nuclear briefcase while we're engaged in a military conflict in Syria with 5 other nations around. I mean, I think we should be encouraging him to withdraw, but we'll see.
And I can't have you go without talking about Russia, of course, because I think it's getting to a point where this is going to be a major issue in the 2020 campaign, and a litmus test. Who is more mouth breathing and fire breathing among Democrats that Russia is responsible for all U.S. ills. Now you have this report that Russia, through their social media campaigns, was targeting African Americans and Jill Stein voters and Bernie voters. I think a lot of that is kind of crazy. There's no empirical way to know if that swayed one vote, much less an election.
Right.
But obviously Mueller, it seems like he's taking his time, but it seems to be maybe closer to the end than the beginning. What are your thoughts on recent developments? Because from what I could read, really these social media troll farms and this and that. I mean, I read the exit polls in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Trade and immigration were the biggest factors. I didn't see anything on WikiLeaks or Russia. Do you think this is going to play a part in 2020?
Well, it was interesting. The Democrats heading into the midterms in the last 2 months, they just pulled the plug on the Russiagate stuff. You didn't hear a peep about it heading into November. And I think that's because they probably saw the polls showed that most people really just don't care about this issue as much as people care about it in Washington and New York and LA. So it's going to depend a lot on what happens with the completion of the Mueller report, which I understand is going to come down probably in mid to late February. If there's something huge there, and that's always been the question with this, is what there is there with this case, then of course it's going to be a major factor. He might be under impeachment while the campaign is going on. But if they don't have a direct hit at the end of this special prosecutor investigation, then I think that becomes an issue for Trump, frankly. So it'll be interesting. I was very surprised the Democrats put so much energy into that issue for 2 years, and then they just sort of let it go for a while, and now they've revived it again. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you think about it, but my sense is that it's going to depend a lot on the end of the investigation.
Yeah, I think it's less about will it be an issue and more about will it be a mechanism and a tool that the
Right.
DNC and others use to stay away from talk about, money in politics and these trade deals and actual issues, and more focus on our democracy is at grave risk because of the
Yeah. I
Russian
mean,
boogeyman.
we've already seen last year the Washington Post ran an editorial that said basically when the Russians decide to support Bernie Sanders, how will Democrats respond? Right. So they're using this kind of guilt by association tactic, with sites like Hamilton 68. It's a mechanism that allows them to point at basically everything, anything, and say the Russians are stoking the Yellow Vest protests. They're stoking Black Lives Matter protests. They're behind the Green Party run. They're behind the Sanders movement. And they're trying with the propaganda idea here is to create an ick factor around all of these various targets. Even if people rationally don't accept it, there's a thing that happens when you follow social media long enough where you just don't want to be the person to tweet, yeah, I don't know about
Hmm.
that, right? And you end up being quiet about it, and then next thing you know, you're accepting the central premise of it. So you don't want to be that person who's tabbed, Putin's favorite, right? And they're definitely going to use that tactic. There's no question about it. It's just a question of how excessive it's going to be.
And last question. So 2006, 2007, there were definitely signs that the housing market was going to crash. There's a whole movie, The Big Short, about that.
Right.
I'm not an economist. I know you don't describe yourself as one, but I think student loans, I don't know if it's a bubble, but it's definitely a problem. I mean, it's projected that by 2023, I believe it is, 40% of borrowers are going to be behind. You're seeing just ballooning debt as we speak. And obviously, there's no cap on how much these universities can charge. It just goes up every year.
Yeah.
If once I have kids, they're going to University of Phoenix online because
Yeah.
I don't know how anyone sends their kids to college these days. What are you seeing as far as student loans? Is there any other sector that has some risky behavior going on that CNBC isn't covering per se?
So student loans are a little different because most of them are federally guaranteed. So the possibility for cascading losses created out of thin air that you have with mortgages isn't as great as it was with the mortgage market. Also, the market's smaller than the mortgage market was. The problem is that the same mechanism that existed to create the subprime mortgage loan problem still exists. You still have the same derivative instruments that allow you to create a lot of credit and sell, tranches of debt. So you can make lots and lots of subprime loans and sell pieces of it as AAA debt. You can do that in any with any kind of debt. You can do it with aircraft loans. You can do it with credit cards. You can do it with car loans and commercial loans, what they call CLOs. And I've heard over the last year or so. I live in a part of the world I live in Jersey City, which is right across the street from the river from Wall Street. And I always there are a lot of Wall Street people in my building, and they say, watch out for the commercial loan market. We're seeing kind of the same bubblish tendencies, but I've been hearing that every year since 2008. So I don't know. I don't think it's the same situation where you could go to any neighborhood in America in 2007 and see that people were getting free houses. I remember getting a home loan myself in 2006, and the application process took 2 minutes. And I remember thinking, well, that can't be right, So we'll see. I mean, student loans is definitely a huge problem. I think it's a massively destructive issue for young people, but I don't know if it's going to be a bubble that bursts anytime soon.
Gotcha. Thank you for taking the time. Obviously, people can find you Rolling Stone and you'll be on the campaign trail. So hopefully I'll see you there once I get a little bit
Absolutely.
more funding, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Good luck with status quo.
Thanks, man.
All right. Take care.